Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We have my pleasure to have Leo, my training partners, Leo Salazar, to with us for this guest lectures. It's part of the intercultural business skill of this University College of Tunku Abdul Rahman Unity College in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. I always invite Leo to give a guest lecture to my students, and every time that we make this guest lecture also open to the public. I would like Leo to share his experience with us as a trainer, as a coach, and a learning and development facilitator with commercial experience and mindset. Leo is an interculturalist practitioner, currently live in Cambodia. I love your place. I believe that you are living comfortably there.
You should come by. The borders are open now, Dave. The borders are open.
I will do it one day.
No quarantine.
He worked with potential leaders in the organization who have the desire and means to develop themselves and their company strategically through strongly relevant content, carefully designed and managed process, and delivering concrete results. So without any furthers, I would like to invite Leo to give us his thought about this topic.
Very nice, very nice. Tay, thank you very much. I appreciate it. By the way, your room looks wonderful. It looks very comfortable behind you. Very nice couch, nice plants, outstanding. Okay, good. Tay, thank you very much for this opportunity. It's very nice to be here. I appreciate you hosting me, and hopefully we can share some ideas about intercultural business and have a good time while we're doing it, and maybe learn something along the way. So before we get started, let me perhaps a short introduction of myself. As Tay said, my name is Leo Salazar. I'm American, born and raised in the Los Angeles area in California in the US, way back in the previous millennium. So I have a long career behind me of training, also course design, course management, facilitation, and so on. I've worked for leadership institutes and business schools, mostly in the Netherlands and Europe. But I've also worked in Germany in banking and finance for American Express in Germany, and have lived and worked a full life amongst different cultures. So I've been here in Asia for about, what does it take, about 5 years now?
Yeah.
I think 5 years ago we first met each other. Yeah. And Tay and I were almost neighbors with each other. We lived very close to each other in Shah Alam in Kuala Lumpur. So but in the meantime, I've moved to Cambodia. And the reason I moved here was to help with some schools that were having some difficulties. I was helping with marketing, fundraising, some management, some course design, and also interviewing teachers. I taught for myself a short time for Cambodian children learning English, which was an interesting experience. I'm sure you can relate, Tay. I figured if I've been training executives for 20 years in front of a classroom, what's the difference between that and teaching children how to speak English? All the same, right? And it is all the same, to be honest. You have the same dynamics. You have the communication, obviously, but also discipline, motivation. So training executives on the one hand to speak English, and then training or teaching children on the other hand. But then because of COVID, obviously, we had to shut down the schools and move everything online. And teaching online in Cambodia is not the same as teaching online in Malaysia, not by a long shot. So we face some significant hurdles in teaching the children. So in light of that, I decided to start teaching online, and I have a program called Workplace English that on the face of it is to help managers working in international environments around the world to communicate better in English. But it's much more than that. It's also coaching, it's also consulting a little bit, and it's yeah, quite interesting. Especially now I have students literally from, well, not literally from every continent, but almost every continent. So North America, South America, Europe, Asia, and including China and Russia are my two biggest markets. And with what's been happening lately, the Russian students have been going through some difficulties, and it's been quite instructive to be very close to what's been happening between Russia and Ukraine since Putin invaded Ukraine on the 24th of February of this year. So I'm sure you've all been watching the news, watching to see what happens there. Not only for the Ukrainians and Russians and Europeans extended from there, but also, for example, to see what lessons might be learned for what may happen regarding Taiwan and China in coming years. They say that Xi Jinping in China is watching the developments in Europe very, very closely to see what lessons he can learn from the way that the US, together with NATO, might provide some sort of instruction for how he might approach Taiwan in the coming years, which, as everybody expects, will have some significant developments, both politically as well as militarily throughout Asia. So my presentation today has to do with this conflict, and what I'd like to do is to give a short presentation. Well, short. Hopefully, we'll be here for roughly 1 hour, and what I would like to do is to touch on some of these points, the developments between Russia and Ukraine, as it pertains to cultural differences, and how what we can learn from this situation in Ukraine and between Ukraine and Russia regarding intercultural differences. So let me share my presentation now. Just a moment. Give me a second to put up the presentation. Okay, that should be working. It's a little bit slow. Okay, it seems to be very slow. Can you still hear me? Okay, can you hear me still?
Yeah, I can hear you, and we can see your sharing of slides. We can see from our side. So
okay, all right.
No issue.
It's because it's dark on my side, so so the presentation is clear then. It's coming through clearly.
It is clear.
Okay.
It is clear.
Okay, good. Let me get started then. Yeah, this opening slide introduces my business, BRIL.Solutions, which Tay is also a partner in, and we work with intercultural learning with organizations. And there's a very recent photograph of both Tay and myself. And yeah, it gives a little biography of what we do, and also what we do together to work with companies regarding intercultural differences. The bottom line is to help companies be more effective in intercultural environments. So Tay, I assume everybody will get a copy of this presentation afterwards, because at the end of the presentation are also a number of links that you can follow for more information regarding.
Yeah, for sure that I will give a link of these recordings and of course, of all the material, everybody will get it.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you. Okay, very good. The title of this presentation, Russia and Ukraine equals shared culture. Does Putin have a point? In other words, does the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, is he justified, for example, in bringing Ukraine, quote, back into the fold? And there are some quite controversial viewpoints on this, not the least of which some university professors in the United States also stand behind Putin's claim to Ukraine, but we'll get into that a little bit later about what from different perspectives, political perspective, social perspective, historical perspective, and also different other aspects. But our focus today won't be per se on those other dynamics. Our focus today will be on culture. So obviously we will touch on those other issues, political, social, and historical, because clearly these have an influence on culture in the end. So what we will do today is we will look first at what is culture. We will also go into a background using one of the cultural frameworks, and this is from Geert Hofstede, the Hofstede dimensions. We'll look briefly at a critical incident. So this will give you an opportunity to do a little challenge, to do a little problem, once you are familiar with the cultural dynamics, and to see how would you approach the situation given your knowledge of intercultural dynamics. The fourth point we will look at will be the cultural dimensions between Russia and Ukraine. And then lastly, that hopefully will lead to an answer, does Putin have a point in going into Ukraine? These 5 points we will cover in the next hour or so. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. Tay, can they just unmute themselves, or do you have to unmute them for them to ask a question?
They can unmute themselves. They can unmute.
Okay,
themselves.
good.
Everyone have
So if you
very
perfect. Okay, thank you. Then if you have a question, feel free to jump right in, unmute yourself and ask the question. I'm not monitoring the comments. Those are with Tay. So if you write a comment, maybe Tay will be able to tell me what the comment is, but I can't see those comments. If you happen to be on Facebook Live, I don't see anybody there, but if somebody is watching on Facebook Live, feel free to add a comment there, and I will answer the Facebook Live. If you see me looking between two different screens, I have the Facebook Live going here, and your guys' presentation here. So yeah, hopefully we'll be able to keep that straight. So to begin, what is culture? I'm sure you've been studying culture, so you know something about what the culture dynamics are. But to give a short and concise definition, and this is from the Professor Hofstede himself, who just recently passed away, by the way, just around less than a year ago, I believe. Yeah, he was well into his 80s, very active. I worked with him myself in the Netherlands, and also have met his son, who has taken over the torch from Professor Hofstede. His son's name is Geert Jan Hofstede. And yeah, he is continuing in his father's footsteps. Professor Hofstede's definition is the collective programming of the mind, which distinguishes the members of one group or category of people from another. So the collective programming of the mind, which distinguishes the members of one group or category of people from another. it's no accident that the subtitle of his classic seminal book on cultures and organizations is The Software of the Mind. And very much so, culture is programmed. There's debates over nature or nurture, and clearly culture is nurture, as we will see in just a few minutes. So, as I mentioned, there are other cultural gurus who also have defined various dimensions, various ways of approaching culture. For example, Edward Hall had two key polarities: low context versus high context, monochronic versus polychronic. We won't go into these other theories. We will focus on Professor Hofstede's national values. But another one is Richard Lewis. If you study culture, you will hear his name quite often, as well as Fons Tropenaars, also a Dutchman, also located in the Netherlands, and Professor Hofstede, who identified dimensions of quote unquote national values. And we'll see later that we use national values, Malaysian versus America, somebody from the US, American versus French, German, what have you, as a shorthand for categorizing cultures. But especially in the case of Russia/Ukraine, you will see that sometimes the borders don't make much difference at all, that the borders between countries are very politically drawn and may have an artificial division between different countries. And you will see that especially if you look at maps and study history of what happened in Africa, the various countries in the Middle East, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, where basically the different countries in the Middle East were created by two British gentlemen who, in a very luxurious smoking room in London, got together and decided how to divide up the Middle East into various countries. Of course, that's a very shorthand way of describing it. But yeah, nevertheless, these are not necessarily natural borders between cultures, but artificial. So the function of culture, as far as Dr. Tay and myself are approaching it, is to avoid a situation like this. So you see here an Asian gentleman who approaches a Western gentleman, and each of them has adopted the other's approach to greeting and hoping to bridge a cultural divide by, the Asian by shaking hands and the Westerner by bowing. It's quite a humorous photo, and it's something that you rarely see in real life for reasons that we'll get into in a minute. Now, partly the reason you don't see this in real life is our Western businessmen, well, actually both of them, are dealing with the cultural iceberg. And this is culture that drives behavior. And with the cultural iceberg, you see that there are, as with the natural iceberg, that the majority of the structure is underneath the water. And what you see of the iceberg above the water is only a small portion of it. So what do we see when we see differences in culture? The most obvious is language. You hear immediately the differences in the way people communicate. Also practices, customs, how they dress, clothing also makes a difference. How they act, and of course, food. Underneath the water and less visible are attitudes and norms, judgments, understandings, assumptions, and that's a very big one, beliefs, and at the bottom, supporting all of this iceberg are the core values that drive the behavior. Now, as implied by this, this means that what you see on the surface is almost nothing. that everything underneath is supporting what you see on the surface. And one thing that people make the mistake of is they see a visible manifestation of culture, for example, clothing or food, and they make assumptions about these visible aspects of culture. They make assumptions that these signs mean something. For example, I remember when McDonald's, for example, first appeared on Red Square in Moscow, and this is in the 1980s and early 1990s, right around the time of the fall of the Berlin Wall and the breakup of the Soviet Union. And also around that time, Levi's jeans, denim jeans, were a big hot ticket item on the black market in Russia. And in the mid and late 1980s, I was living in Germany at the time, and there were people who were filling up trailers full of blue jeans and driving them to East Europe to their buyer to be imported into Russia, into Soviet Union. And yeah, the point is, these are external manifestations of culture. And the feeling was, at least amongst Americans, were that, look, the Russians, they're wearing blue jeans, our quote unquote blue jeans. They are eating our food, McDonald's in Red Square. This means they're becoming more like us. The Russians, or the Soviets in this case, they want freedom. They want democracy. They want to be just like America. And yeah, that's part of what's driving the current conflict between Russia and Ukraine at the moment. This sort of cultural approbation of the signs of culture, sometimes, but most often not, are indications of what is happening deeper underneath the surface. So now, looking back at our two businessmen friends, what they are doing is they are relying on stereotypes. And the stereotypes in this case are what you see on the surface. So a widely held but fixed and oversimplified image of a particular type of person or thing. And it's very easy to rely on stereotypes when you're dealing with different cultures, because, like I said, it gives you the feeling that they're just like you. If they dress like you, eat like you, maybe speak your language, that they are also deep inside, deep under the iceberg, also just like you, and that may not be the case. In fact, in many cases, it's not the case. So just a moment. Yeah. So relying on stereotypes, unfortunately, often leads to what they call cognitive bias or cultural bias. And there are three very important aspects to cultural bias. And that is, number one, it creates implicit stereotypes, sometimes called subconscious bias. And this is when you have an association between groups of people with traits or certain activities and so on that mean something regarding the people as a whole. Now, this is not just country cultures. You also have it, for example, amongst genders, amongst the sexes. For example, that men are stronger in maths and sciences, women are stronger in arts and languages, that these are stereotypes that drive subconscious bias. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, well, just look at a typical math or science program or technology, and you see all the men there. It must be true. Well, unfortunately, it is only true because it's been reinforced by society, building on these stereotypes. If you doubt me, look at any, for example, a preschool or kindergarten or early primary school grades, that you will see that the boys in those groups are being very consciously steered towards the technical, and the girls in these groups are constantly steered towards the more the softer skills, such as languages and caring professions, such as nursing, if they're steered towards professions at all. Often the girls are encouraged to simply study and pursue not a career, but to study to care for a family, for example. So implicit stereotypes leads to subconscious bias. In-group favoritism is also a danger when you rely on stereotypes. And what is this? In-group favoritism. It's a preference for people who are like us. So the in-group, the people of our group. So the same nationality, gender, race, background, and so on. Oftentimes you see companies, for example, who consistently hire people who look like them. The argument that many companies use when they do this is cultural fit, that in order to work in our company, you need to think like us, you need to be like us, you need to look like us. And what happens is you create this vicious circle where hiring managers, for example, HR functions, lead managers, team managers, for example, are constantly choosing people that look, think, and act like them. Now, why is that dangerous, you ask? Because what happens is you wind up only listening to people who think, talk, and communicate just like you. It means you're not open to new ideas. It means that you're not receptive to different perspectives or different ways of seeing things. And these favoritisms, these cultural biases, can sometimes go very, very deep. And let me complete the third point, and I'll give you an indication of how deep these cognitive biases go. The third aspect, so we have implicit stereotypes, we have in-group favoritism, and we have, thirdly, out-group homogeneity bias. Now, what does that mean? That means that you see the differences within your own group, and those people outside of your group all look the same, that they are interchangeable, homogeneous, that people within an in-group notice the differences and only see people from outside based on their outside appearance as whether they belong to the in-group. Now, sometimes you hear companies talk about, diversity of thought. Yes, we have diversity in our company. We have diversity of thought. We think differently. But when you look at it, you think, how can that be? Because all of these people have all gone to the same schools. They've all had the same careers. They've had predictable ways that they've lived their lives and predictable plans for their futures. All of them the same. But amongst themselves, they notice the differences. And they say to themselves, yes, see how diverse we are? Bob, he studied at Yale, but Jim, he studied at Harvard. And Mike, he studied at MIT. Isn't that different? Well, it's not different at all, really. These are all Ivy League schools. Well, technically not MIT, but you know what I mean. They're elite higher education institutions, and these lead to homogeneous ways of thinking, approaching business, making decisions, and so on. So one thing I wanted to mention about this cognitive bias, this cultural bias, is that very often you read lately about what a role artificial intelligence is playing, machine learning is playing in our lives, and how increasingly decisions will be made for us using various forms of technology. Now, the danger here is that this technology is being programmed by a very biased group of individuals. Most programmers are male, white, young. And when they are programming for apps, for technology, they think about themselves as the target group. They don't think about people outside of their in-group. For example, if you are designing an app, you design it in such a way, for example, that all of the movements in the app go from left to right. Because obviously, that's how all of us communicate, right? From left to right. Wrong. In Arabic, it's from right to left, as a very simple example. People who are colorblind, for example, cannot see various parts of screens when they're up. And there are very few companies who take into account that there are people who simply cannot use your product because of various disabilities, various ways of communicating, and so on. It doesn't even occur to them to include other people outside of their in-group in their programming language. Now, there are exceptions to this, and one major exception is Microsoft, believe it or not. Microsoft has been, in recent years, pushing very hard to become more diverse, to bring in different perspectives, and to be more open to diversity of thought. One of my students is she's head of cybersecurity for Latin America. She's in Brazil. She, head of cybersecurity, located in Brazil, has been telling me what major change has taken place within Microsoft in the last 2 or 3 years, since the new CEO Satya, I forget his last name, since he has taken over. The old days of Steve Ballmer, and especially of Bill Gates, that old way of thinking from the 80s, 90s, and early aughts, is gone. Microsoft now thinks inclusively. They think diversity. They are looking actively for ways to include everybody in the conversation. And it's really an encouraging sign that at least one major influential company recognizes these biases and is taking active steps to prevent them. So, stereotypes leading to cognitive bias, and gives you an idea of how important cultural awareness plays in business, and how being aware of cultural differences can make your company more competitive. It can make you more competitive, and can open doors for both you as an individual as well as companies that have never been opened before. So my next section will be to look at the individual dimensions that Professor Hofstede defined. But before we go there, are there any questions so far? No questions? Anybody? Okay, let me check my Facebook Live, which is still going. Okay, no questions there. All right. No questions for the time being. Thank you, Yakang. Appreciate it. Apparently I can see the comments. So thanks. All right, very good. All righty, now we will go to the Hofstadter dimensions. Geert Hofstadter defined, now initially he defined 4 dimensions, but gradually as his research matured and became more thorough, he added on 2 extra dimensions. And these dimensions are power distance, individualism, masculinity, uncertainty avoidance, long-term orientation, and indulgence. That last item, indulgence, is relatively recent. So most of the material that I have that I'm going to present to you deals with the first 5 of the dimensions, from power distance through and including long-term orientation. So there's more information available, and as I mentioned before, I will send links at the together with the presentation so that you can look up the details of these dimensions yourself. But we will now go over them briefly, because it's important for us to examine these to understand and answer our question regarding Putin and Ukraine. So, to begin with, power distance. Now, you have what power distance is that you have a measurement of, I'm sorry, let me back up a little bit. How Geert Hofstadter, Professor Hofstadter, came upon these dimensions, a little historical note, is that he worked for IBM in the 1950s and 60s, and he was asked to make a study of IBM employees over the whole world, because it was noticed that as IBM became more international, they were running into continual communication problems. As they brought on board people from different cultures and different countries, they noticed that the communication became often much more difficult. And IBM at the time had a social sciences department, and they asked the social sciences department, perhaps there are some predictable patterns behind these communication problems that we can study and that we can help to that can help us communicate better and work more effectively in the future. So they asked Professor Hofstadter to head this study, which he did. And what he did is he went around to IBM offices all over the world with a questionnaire regarding various behaviors, choices, different ways of working and communicating, and compiled all of these into databases in which he was able to make general approximations of how a particular employee of IBM might react to, for example, power based on a continuum, low power distance versus high power distance. And one might make the argument that, well, this is a marvelous study of IBM employees over the whole world, but what does that have to do with the general populace of that country? Fair point. And since that study, Professor Hofstadter then deepened and broadened both his methodology as well as the resources that he had available to him to continue to study these dimensions in more depth and detail. So what he's come up with is an overview, which is online. You can look at it. It's a very handy tool. I'll provide that at the end, which shows you the various differences between different countries and how they compare to each other on this continuum. that one country will be, for example, low in power distance, the other country high in power distance. And what does that mean from when one person from this country is being managed by a person from this country? What does that mean for their, not only their power relationship, supervisor, employee, but also their communication, also how they see each other, perception, and so on. So it's a very, very handy tool when comparing different cultures with each other. And that's very important, what I mentioned, when comparing, because the power of this tool is in the comparison between different countries. Now, you're probably wondering what I'm talking about, and I'll show you more in detail later, that what exactly that all means. And but first, let's go through the 6 dimensions and see what they are just briefly. So the first being power distance. And power distance defined is how the less powerful members of a society accept and expect that power is distributed unequally. So what it means is that there are inequalities among people in every country. In every country, some people have the power, some people don't. Some people are rich, some people are poor, all over the world. Now, how you accept that and what sorts of rewards, for example, the people who have the power can expect is a measurement of this power distance dimension. So, for example, and what you will see is that various institutions, companies, for example, that are based in those countries will treat power differently. So, just an example, in a high power distance country, the boss is the boss. Whatever the boss says, you do it without question. As they used to say in the military in the U.S., when the colonel says to do something, your only question is when and how. So when the colonel says jump, your question is how high. End of story. You don't question why they made that decision, and that's what you see in low power distance countries, such as Scandinavian countries are very famous for this. The Netherlands was also very famous for this. If somebody, if your boss tells you to do something, your reaction isn't to just do it. Your reaction is to say, well, I don't know if that's such a good idea. And that you get feedback, that you get pushback from the employees when the boss says to do something. And I'm sure Malaysia, you're all from Malaysia. Malaysia is a very high power distance country. When your boss says to do something, you don't question it, you do it. And for those who have worked in other countries, you may be shocked to hear how people react to the boss. But in those countries with low power distance, that's accepted. That's how it is. For example, as it says here, that supervisors and employees are considered almost as equals, that they are simply working on a team together, and everybody can tell the boss what they think. Doesn't matter. Whereas with high power distance companies, you have very strong hierarchies, very centralized. Decisions are made in the head office. And the people who are at the top of the organization not only get a great deal of authority and respect from everybody else in the organization, they are also rewarded for being the boss. Very centralized. Japanese companies, for example. It's rare to work for a Japanese company, for example, in a branch in another country. All decisions for that Japanese company are made in Tokyo. I've worked with, for example, Fuji, the Japanese film company, and Fuji in Europe had a very difficult time in operating because they always had to wait for their home office in Tokyo to make decisions. Sometimes about the very basic operating decisions of that company, they had to wait to hear from Tokyo. And you look at companies that are more nimble, more able to make decisions on the fly, able to respond to events that are happening on the ground in that country. It's very difficult if you always have to wait for the home office to make a decision. It slows down the entire decision-making process. So with each of these cultural dimensions, there will also be some tips on how to respond if you are in a country or accompanied from a country that has that culture with, for example, high power distance. You always have to acknowledge a leader's power, and you always have to be aware that making decisions on the local level just isn't going to happen. You have to go to the boss for a decision. When you're working in a low power distance country, you can rely on teamwork. You have lots of people involved in the decision. So that's power distance. Going to individualism. Individualism looks at the social framework. Is it a loose social framework in which individuals feel free to make a decision on their own? Or is it a very tight collectivist social environment where people are rely on the collective strength of the society and are not so inclined to make decisions for themselves? So it all has to do with self-image, for example. Do you think in terms of I, or do you think in terms of we? When you are making a presentation, do you say, I'm the one who made these decisions and made this happen? Or do you talk about the team? We did this together. So in countries with high individualism, you see that people talk about themselves, that they are rewarded for making decisions and being aggressive, for example. They are, it's very a highly challenging environment, but when you make decisions on your own, you're very well rewarded for your work. Low individualism means that working together is very important, that the harmony of the group is of primary importance, and even that the harmony of the group is more important than honesty. And oftentimes you see that the two dimensions, power distance and individualism, are correlated. That a high power distance country will also be low in individualism. And aspects such as corruption with people at the top of the government is tolerated, even encouraged by the general populace, because this is something that this person enjoyed. You see, for example, here in Cambodia, you see that very clearly, that the people who are high in government enjoy the rewards of power. I've read recently, and I don't want to get into any sensitive political areas, shall we call it, but I read, for example, that Najib Razak is busy campaigning for his Omo party, and had a very successful campaign in Johor, despite him being not only convicted but also sentenced to 12 years in prison for corruption. Okay. This is something that is very cultural, something that is accepted by Malaysians, not all, of course, but this sort of thing could not happen in a country with a low power distance, for example. Good. Okay, so that's power distance, individualism. Next, we have masculinity. Now, masculinity means that when a country is high in masculinity, that the roles that men play and women play in society are very well defined. You have men's work and you have women's work. Also, that you have in a high masculinity country preference and rewards for achievement, assertiveness, success is very strongly rewarded, where and society in general is far more competitive. In a low masculinity country or feminine society, the gender split in roles is much less. You have men and women performing the same roles. For example, high visibility in politics, in the sciences, for example. You see far more women active, for example, in STEM, technology, engineering, mathematic roles, than you do in high masculinity countries. So powerful and successful women are admired and respected. And in general, the society with low masculinity is also more caring for itself. So there are many structures within the society that encourage people to care for each other. There are social programs, welfare programs, healthcare, for example, is a top priority. And it's no surprise, perhaps, that a country that is low in individualism is also high in, or also low in masculinity, because being part of the collective also means caring for each other in that collective. So some of the tips, and as a shorthand, just as with individualism, it's a question between I or we. In masculine cultures versus feminine cultures, it's a choice between tough and tender. Now, to be clear, this does not mean strong versus weak, because highly collective, high feminine cultures can be very strong, because let's argue that they are using the best of the resources they have to offer. Male and female, doesn't make a difference. But unfortunately, in modern society, masculine is seen as strong, feminine is seen as weak, which is unfortunate. So, power distance, individualism, masculinity. Now we have uncertainty avoidance. And this is sometimes a bit difficult for people to understand. What it means is that the rules that society has, well, let's back up. Uncertainty and ambiguity. How do we deal with that? Now, number one, life is uncertain. We don't know what's going to happen in the next 10 minutes, much less what's going to happen next year or in the next decade. Inshallah, whatever happens will happen. But how do we deal with that? Do we make lots of rules and policies, lots of structure that helps us to cope with the future? Or are we more relaxed? Do we say, what's going to happen is going to happen. Not much we can do about it anyway. Might as well just live for the day and let the chips fall where they may, to coin a phrase. So it's no surprise that countries with a strong uncertainty avoidance have very rigid codes of belief and behavior. They're very intolerant of unusual or unorthodox ways of behaving. So, and then weak uncertainty avoidance countries are much more tolerant of, yeah, just do what you do, be yourself, be more relaxed, that what you do in practice is much more important than what you would do in principle. So, yeah, this is for some people a little bit difficult to understand, but the tips involved, if you find yourself in a high uncertainty avoidance country, you need to be very clear about your planning, your communication. You need to tell your people what's going to happen as far as you can control it, as much as you can. That you communicate in a very direct, clear style, so that there's no ambiguity about what is expected of your people. Low uncertainty avoidance means that you pretty much let people take their own paths. You are more calm, you are more accepting of the circumstances, and you don't put a lot of emphasis on rules or principles. It's interesting looking at Europe. The more northern you go in Europe, the higher the uncertainty avoidance. The lower you go, the lower it is. I'm sorry, it's the other way around. The higher you go, the lower it is. The lower you go, the higher it is. For example, in the UK, looking at, well, Europe's not in or the UK isn't in Europe anymore, at least not the EU. Well, let's use a generalization. So, looking at the UK, they have the fewest number of laws on the books, because they know that the laws that are there are clear, they are certain, and that people will follow them. The lower you go, for example, Greece or Italy, they have far more rules on the books, far more detailed, what is legal, what is not legal. But the problem is nobody follows them. It's if you look, for example, at income taxes, just as an example, in the UK, the number of people who pay their income taxes is relatively high, 85%, 85, 90% in some estimates. In the South, in Greece, Italy, for example, it's almost a sport in finding ways to not pay your income taxes. And the rate of income tax payment in the southern countries of Europe is very, very low. Lots of rules, nobody follows them. So that's a very concrete example of different levels of uncertainty avoidance. So we had power distance, individualism, masculinity, uncertainty avoidance, and long-term orientation. And long-term orientation has to do with the links between a country's or a society's past and its challenges of the present and the future. So societies prioritize these different existential goals differently, depending on how they see the world. So, for example, from a culture that is high in long-term orientation, it's a much more pragmatic approach. Thrift is encouraged, and also modern education, investments in education are very high in order to prepare for the future. For example, China is very much long-term orientation. It's a bit of perhaps, I'm not sure if it's really true, but it is said that companies in China make decisions that will influence 7 generations into the future. because they understand that high planning, education, training, respecting what has happened in the past as an indication of what will happen in the future is very much valued. You also see that face and not losing face is very important in high long-term orientation countries. Low LTO, much more individualist, looking at self-actualization, for example, that you have societal change is sometimes looked at with suspicion. But on the other hand, you are also very respectful of others, and you don't necessarily introduce changes rapidly, but you do them as long as it's clear. So, power distance, individualism, masculinity, uncertainty, avoidance, long-term orientation. And then the last one, and I don't have a slide for it, but the last one is indulgence. And indulgence is a society that allows for relatively free gratification of basic and natural human drives regarding enjoying life, having fun. Restraint is how much the gratification of these needs is regulated by strict social measures. So, for example, no surprise you see in the US is a very high indulgence society. You work hard, you play hard, you are allowed to reward yourself for working hard and playing hard. You buy a fast car, you go out to eat often if you're successful, you buy a big house. These are all things that are encouraged to indulge yourself. In other countries, there's more emphasis on planning for the long term, not spending today, investing, and so on, and planning more for the long term. It's no surprise that long-term orientation and indulgence are very closely related. High long-term orientation is generally correlated with low indulgence, and vice versa. Low long-term orientation, living for today, means that you are free to indulge yourself to spend as you feel appropriate. So those are the 6 dimensions. Sometimes people ask, do these dimensions change? Are there any, are these written in stone, for example? Will a society remain the same over the longer term? And the answer is, of course not. Societies do change. All of these dimensions are in flux. They often, some aspects go higher, go lower. The research that Gerrit Hofstede did is continually being updated. New research is coming, adding to the database, and keeping these different dimensions up to date. So sometimes in your own country, you can notice changes over the long term regarding these different cultural dimensions. For example, in the US, I see that indulgence has it's ebbed and waned. It's gone higher and lower. For example, the 1970s was called the me decade, where people were very focused on themselves, and then went into the 1980s, in which greed is good, a quote from the movie Wall Street with Michael Douglas. It was seen that rewarding oneself became much more acceptable, whereas the US in the 1950s and 60s was very conservative. That people saved lots of money, invested, didn't do crazy things with their money, and were generally building for the long term. But over the generations, that has changed. So, and different aspects of society go into changing culture. and perhaps I'm not sure if we'll have enough time to get into any of that. But yeah, it's those are the basics of culture. Now I see that more than an hour has gone by, so let me check my Facebook. Okay, it's going well. Let's now go into what does this look like, culture, in real life. I've given you a few examples, but let's look at more concrete examples. And one of them is, let's skip over that. This I found very interesting. I took this photo myself. This is in the Utrecht train station in the Netherlands. And what I found remarkable was the differences. Now, number one, you see the difference in height between the young woman who is Asian. I'm not sure where exactly she's from, but she's clearly Asian. And the man in front of her is Dutch. Just amazing to see the height difference between them. But what caught my eye mostly was not the difference in height, but the difference in how they're standing next to each other. You see the two people at the counter are, they might even be American. I'm not sure if they're Dutch, but they're Westerners at any rate. And there's a good meter and a half between them and the tall gentleman in the middle, and between the young Asian girl and the woman behind her, who is Dutch, also roughly a meter and a half. But the distance between the young Asian woman and the tall Dutchman is negligible. Now this photo was taken pre-COVID, so you see nobody's wearing a mask, nobody's asking to stand 1.5 meters apart. Yeah, so this is it shows very clearly difference in culture, how a society lines up. And you're familiar with it also if you go to a high collectivist, so low individualism country. You often see people rushing in together. The famed Japanese subways, for example, where they cram people in with sticks. You would not see in high individualist countries, such as the Netherlands or even in the US. If, on the other hand, if you went to Asia and tried to line up like you do in the Netherlands, you would never get to the front because people would be always cutting in front of you in line and taking your turn. So I have a critical incident, but yeah, let's do this real quick. I want to have time to go over the cultural dimensions between Russia and Ukraine. No, in fact, let's skip over this if that's okay. I want to make sure we have enough time for everything. So let's do these some other time. Okay, Russian versus Ukraine, cultural dimensions. Now, we've been talking about the differences in these 6 cultural dimensions. I have gone to a website, and I will, as I mentioned before, I'll provide the link for the website in the follow-up. So you can do it yourself. You can compare different countries and how they measure against each other regarding cultural dimensions. This Russia versus Ukraine, I put it into the Hofstede Insights site, and here's the result. Here you see the 6 cultural dimensions: power distance, individualism, masculinity, uncertainty avoidance, long-term orientation, and indulgence. The link is there in the bottom of the slide. So you see there, datainsights.com, country comparison, and then this is Russia, Ukraine. And you can put any countries you want in there to compare to each other. And to be clear, I want to make sure I said this already, but to make the strength in the tool and the strength in using these dimensions as a way to do better business in different cultures is in the comparison. It has little use to look at one single country and the cultural dimensions, but in that particular country. It's always in the comparison between countries. So Russia is in blue, Ukraine is in purple. And you see that power distance, uncertainty avoidance are virtually identical. So if we look at the others, individualism, very close. Russia slightly higher. Similarly with masculinity and uncertainty avoidance. I'm sorry, a long-term orientation, a slight difference. And indulgence also a difference. Now, Ukraine has an asterisk by it, which means that they haven't been able to do in-depth research into Ukraine, that it's an estimation of the dimensions. Now, for our purposes, roughly, you can say that the cultures of Russia and Ukraine are very, very similar. Now, let's throw a third country into the mix. Let's put Malaysia in here. And here we see much more marked differences. Malaysia being in blue, Russia in purple, Ukraine in green. So my apologies for the mix-up of the colors, but that's the way it comes out. So you see power distance, almost the same. By the way, power distance in Malaysia is the highest of any country, which means that those with power are expected to have rewards, are to be respected for their authority, and unquestioned in terms of decisions that they make. Yeah. And there's very, very many examples of this. You read it in the press all the time. At least people from outside Malaysia see it very clearly. It's somewhat more difficult to notice inside Malaysia. But the big differences between Malaysia, Russia, and Ukraine are in masculinity a bit. So you see that Malaysian society is much more aggressive, ambitious. Russian and Ukraine society a bit more feminine, caring for each other, and so on. The big differences are in uncertainty avoidance, long-term orientation, and indulgence. So you might think, let's look at the last one, indulgence. You might think with all the talk of the oligarchs, and you know what oligarchs are, right? Oligarchs being people with power who have villas on the Mediterranean, they own aircraft, they own football clubs, as does Abramovich, or did. And you would think, well, these are men with great power, with great wealth, and they're indulging themselves. Shouldn't it be higher? The aspect that you should look at is power distance. So these are men with power. The reason that they have these villas, football teams, planes, and cars is because they are close to power. They have been granted by Putin the ability to have these trappings of great power. So the reason that the oligarchs have these riches isn't necessarily because of their hard work and determination. It is more because they are close to power. For example, you could not call rich people in the US, oligarchs, Mark Zuckerberg with Facebook, Jeff Bezos with Amazon, Elon Musk with Tesla, they also have these trappings of power. That because they are in a high individualist country like America, they have earned these riches through their companies, their decisions, their hard work. So showing power because showing these indulgences because you're close to power does not work in the U.S. because there's implied corruption with these aspects. So yeah. So now let's go to oh yeah, let's compare just for fun Malaysia and the U.S. So Malaysia in blue, U.S. in purple. So as I mentioned, indulgence in the U.S. is high. Individualism is very, very high. In fact, it's the highest of any country. But power distance is low, which means that you don't have riches in the US because you are close to power. You have riches because you have worked hard as an individual and you've been ambitious, relatively high masculinity, and you are able to indulge yourself in that way. Also, low long-term orientation. So you're living for today in the US, not necessarily building for tomorrow. So that's the various aspects of culture as it relates to US and Malaysia. Now let's go back up to Russia, Ukraine. And our question was, does Putin have a point? In other words, if you look at this chart in terms of culture, you see that Ukraine and Russia are very, very similar. There's only a couple of dimensions where they vary at all. So you might think, well, they're kind of the same people, aren't they? And indeed, when Putin made his speech to the Russian people a few days before invading Ukraine, and this speech was seen as a justification, his reasons for invading Ukraine. One of the questions that everybody asked after Russia invaded was, why did Putin do this? Well, he told us. He said it out loud for anybody who was paying attention. He said, Ukraine for us is not a neighboring country. It is an integral part of our own history, culture, and spiritual space. He said further, these are our comrades, relatives, among whom are not only colleagues, friends, former colleagues, but also relatives, people connected with us by blood, family ties. So, and he made various claims that Ukraine was created by Russia. And here, let me give you the exact quote. Here, he said, this is his justification for what turned out to be the impending invasion of Ukraine. He stated that Ukraine is not just a neighboring country for us. It is an inalienable part of our own history, culture, and spiritual space. Modern Ukraine was entirely and fully created by Russia. More specifically, the Bolsheviks, Communist Russia. This process began immediately after the 1917 revolution, and moreover, Lenin and his associates did it in the sloppiest way. So he's distancing himself from Lenin and Stalin and the Soviet Union as it existed up until 1989 by dividing and tearing from her pieces of her own historical territory. So this was his justification for going into Ukraine. Now, I think the New York Times said it best. It said that as a misreading of history, it was extreme even by the standards of Mr. Putin. He said that he claimed that the Russian people and Ukrainians were the same going back to the 9th century. That there's thousands of years of history that support his claim that Russia and Ukraine are the same. And what he then did, okay, the first Chechen war wasn't Putin's; it was Boris Yeltsin, his predecessor. Went very badly. When Putin came to power, the first thing he did was to go back into Chechen and to bring the Chechen Republic back into the Russian fold. And after that, he invaded Georgia. After that, Crimea in 2014. The Donbass, which is the eastern section of Ukraine, also in 2014. And then Ukraine proper on February 24th. Now, it's important to understand this because the invasion of Ukraine didn't come out of nowhere. It had precedents. And partly the reason that Putin felt confident in invading Ukraine is because there was relatively little done in response to these other conflicts. For example, there was very little reaction to his invasion of Georgia in 2008. There were some sanctions from the West, but nothing strenuous. Certainly with Ukraine, there were sanctions, but there was no military pushback and very little political pushback from the rest of the world. So he figured, well, if I can just go in and take countries at will, that's what I'm going to do. And he used various justifications. And in fact, these justifications are also supported by, of all people, a university professor in the US. Back in 2015, he made a speech, a presentation, in which he blames the crisis in Ukraine, which, keep in mind, is here, 2014. So that's Crimea and the Donbass. He blames it on the West. Now, he's very specific. He says 1999, NATO expansion. 2004, again, NATO expansion, in which led to the Orange Revolution, supposedly, the overthrow of the previous strong man in Ukraine, Lukashenko, and placing with the current man who's in charge, what's his name? Forgotten his name. Anyway, but most specifically, he blames 2006, in which George W. Bush and the State Department under him decided to make Ukraine and Georgia a part of NATO and EU. Now, according to this professor, this was a direct, aggressive, existential threat to Russia, these various moves. So the response to this was that Putin felt threatened, and because he felt threatened, he took Crimea and then began the civil war in the Donbass in 2014. And then later, but Mearsheimer saw this coming, according to him, the invasion of Ukraine last month. So he blames NATO and EU and the US for Putin's invasion, which, is many people argue that is not at all the case, especially historical. And this is quite entertaining because when people started claiming that, especially from the Russian side, that Russia was perfectly justified because Ukraine was Russia, the American embassy in Moscow put up on Twitter this very entertaining meme showing that Kiev had already been established starting in 996 and was already a well-developed, well-functioning cultural society, whereas Moscow was nothing, just a bunch of trees in the woods. Shortly after that, the Russian embassy in the US put this out, showing that Moscow itself had a long history. Now, I'm not sure exactly what this proves, but yeah, this is people trying to make the argument that there's historical precedence for Russia invading Ukraine. And then somebody put up on Twitter this and said, well, while we're at it, why don't we go back to the 12th century or the 13th, 14th century and give it all to the Mongols, because the Mongols were essentially in charge of all Asia and Eastern Europe, going all the way down into modern day India. Yeah, so that's the danger in making these historical precedents. Is you can pick and choose pretty much any historical precedents to make your argument, but what really counts is what is happening now, and trying to correct historical grievances or historical wrongs by taking modern states is dangerous and spurious at the best. So the answer to the question, does Putin have a point? These 4 points. Number one, Ukraine is a sovereign state. Whether you can argue that there was a history of unity between Ukraine and Russia, or that the heart of the Russian soul was based in Kiev for thousands of years, the fact is that Ukraine is a sovereign state. And that Putin's version of Ukraine's creation is simply a perversion of history. And let me see, the quote from the New York Times, as I mentioned, is says it well, that it's just absurd that he would go that far. Modern liberal societies should not resolve historical grievances through unprovoked war. Now, many Russians have been pointing the finger at the US, of course, saying, well, what about Iraq? What about Afghanistan? You know, these are countries that you also invaded on spurious historical and legal grounds. Yes, that's true. However, that is not a justification for invading a sovereign nation. You can't point the finger and say, well, they did it, that means we can do it also, right? Wrong. Countries have a right to exist, and a cultural history of their own, and simply saying we're righting a historical wrong going back to pre-Soviet times to reestablish the Russian imperial empire. That's not it's an explanation, but it's not a justification. Very important difference. So that's it. Like I said, the reference material I will send along. There are various links that you can read regarding Hofstede. Richard Nisbet is also a a very entertaining and also enlightening author regarding especially the differences between East and West. There's also a test that you can take that you can test your own biases, the Harvard Implicit Association Test. And yeah, many others. I will add some more references to this list before Dr. Tay sends you the presentation. So that's it. Any questions?
I have no questions, as you and I are knowing each other very well. If I would, we have I would say that we have the same set of knowledge. And then
We do.
I would like, oh yes, you have more knowledge than me. We have different.
Oh, Dr. Tay, please. Tay.
No, we have the same set. We have the same set of knowledge from different perspective. It's my pleasure to meet.
Indeed.
You.
That's it.
Yeah.
Same but different.
So, and my pleasure to have a partner like you since 5 years ago, and we really progressing through these particular knowledge domains, and we have a good time in Amsterdam. We have a good time in Malaysia, and hopefully,
Indeed.
I will hopefully that if time is allowed, then I may visit Cambodia. Then I will go.
I hope so.
Okay,
I would like
to let the students. I would like the student to ask any questions. Any one of the students like to ask a question. Please indicate that do you have any question to ask or not. You may not need to voice it out, but you can put it into a message. As usual, Asian student will remain silent. This is one of the interesting cultural phenomena
Indeed.
Okay.
Malaysia's high in power distance, Tay. Yeah. It's the highest.
So,
so when the professor speaks, Leo, you listen.
Leo, one of our participants who are the academic staff from the University College, can you see the message your side? Or you want me to read it out for you? I
can see it. Yeah. It said, I have a question on the Ukraine war. Would you agree if I say that if the president of UK accepted the arguments of Putin, then the war will go the same pathway like Crimea? I'm afraid so. Yeah. Because the proposals of President Putin are to allow the Donbass, the eastern section of Ukraine, to be independent, autonomous regions. But of course, the Russian soldiers who are there now will most likely remain there as a defensive posture. Yeah, and another one of the conditions of Putin is that Ukraine demilitarizes itself. So if Ukraine gives up its military, then what's to stop Putin from again coming in and taking over again and replacing Zelensky, President Zelensky, with a puppet president that belongs to that is under the control of Russia? So I'm afraid so. Yes, my argument is that they're similar culturally. However, Ukraine is a sovereign state. There is a border between the two, and there is a very interesting. I will add it to the references. There was a fascinating presentation that was made the day before the invasion by the Nigerian representative to the UN General Assembly. And he said, look at Africa. Our borders were not drawn by us. Our borders were drawn by colonial powers. Yet, if we're always fighting over these borders and trying to unify based on historical grievances, we would always be fighting with each other, always trying to unify our historical cultural ties, instead of investing in our country as it now stands, the borders as they now stand, to become more powerful economically, as well as successful in terms of global business. So his message, more or less, was stop fighting over borders, accept the fact that, okay, Russians and Ukrainians are very similar culturally, But does that mean they need to be one country? You could just as well, and that's one of the arguments that Putin has used, is that he says, well, look, they all speak Russian. All of the, especially in the east of the country, their native language is Russian. Therefore, they must be Russian. And that would be like saying that all Americans are English because we all speak English. It's absurd. Or that all Mexicans, for example, belong to Spain because they speak Spanish. It's yeah, a shared culture does not necessarily mean that you should be subjugated, taken over by a by a stronger power. Yeah.
Okay, Leo, can
I,
I
I,
input
I
further?
hope that I hope that answers the question. Yeah.
Can I input further into your
Yeah.
talking about the cultures and politics are two different things. So
Mhm.
can I say that the politics have more power than culture? Because in this case, as I see that this is all a political behavior. And one of the first thing is that, can I say that the politic is one of the main factors that causes all those problem in between Russian and the Ukrainians? Or can I say that on the other hand also, historically, it is the political forces that will mold or to develop cultures of a particular country. I mean, it's something like a chicken and eggs kind of a argument. So can you input further from my comment?
Yeah. As I mentioned, there are many influences on culture. Political is but one. There are also very many other. You saw that in the on the Hofstadter dimensions. You saw that some of the dimensions, Ukraine and Russia, are starting to move apart. Now, why are they moving apart? Part of the reason is, for example, that Ukraine is leaning to the West, going from having Russia as a main trading partner to having the EU as a main trading partner, and seeing the benefits of a free, fair, and open trade. Well, relatively open with the West as opposed to Russia. The EU has a much larger market. It's much more profitable. There are many more opportunities for Ukrainian businesses to do business in the EU as opposed to Russia. I mean, what does Russia have, really? It has an economy that is smaller than Italy, that's about the size of Texas in the US, and is shrinking rapidly. What do they have? Gas, oil, wood, some minerals, not much else. So Ukraine sees a big advantage in doing more business economically with the EU than with Russia. Now, those economic influences, not political, not otherwise, those economic differences are perhaps, or economic influences are perhaps responsible for that differing in cultures between Russia and Ukraine. The more time passes, the more Ukraine is free to do business with the West, the more these cultural dimensions will start to drift apart. At least that's what I think.
Yeah, I agree with you, Leo, that the you can see that the this thing happened in mainland China and Taiwan as well. They share the same cultural roots. They share the same language, and then you start to see that the cultural value are separated. You know, I did have some reading about this, and some of these some researchers are doing that parts also, and you start to see not so very drastic difference, but eventually, if you, as we all know that to change the cultural value, you take 2 to 3 generations, but maybe along the line, maybe another 2-3 generations, the cultural value change. Okay.
One of my clients is high up in the organization of the semiconductor company TSMC in Taiwan, and he's about our age. And so he has seen Taiwan develop, from the refuge of Chiang Kai-shek to being the economic dynamo that it is today. And I asked him, I said, if and when China invades, most likely the reason they're doing so is for your company. They want to take over TSMC. They want the possibility to manufacture semiconductors themselves instead of simply taking it from client foundries downstream. And he said, yeah, we realize that. And they are working on safeguards to prevent poison pill, as they put it, to prevent China from taking over the company. So yeah,
But
these
Leo,
are all.
You know that the success of TSMC is not because of the knowledge of the people they have. It is the knowledge of the people of TSMC. It's not the access. It's not what, unless you have all those people with you. Otherwise, you cannot create another TSMC again.
That's exactly. You mean if China takes over TSMC, they're not going to be able to keep it as it is.
Yes. Yes, because you don't have the people. It is the people who run the
That's one thing. The other thing he said, and this is part of the poison pill, is that all the suppliers would immediately stop. So if China took over TSMC, they would have a bunch of buildings and machines, but these machines need maintenance. They would break down very quickly. So
and there's a company in China, SIMC. Also, they are all, for most of the time, they are taking a lot of people's talents from the rest of the regions. Like they are employing all the chief executive, all those senior manager from TSMC. But they are not successful. Why? Because of the ecosystem as well. Okay, thank you very much, Leo.
And the culture.
Yeah.
Thank you, Tay. Thank you very much.
So Leo, thank you very much for giving us your valuable input again. This become like an annual event. It become an annual event. And,
I enjoyed it.
We are trying, and with this kind of webinars, and we can keep in touch and to say hello to each other at least, because we can't see face to face now. Okay, for the rest of students, do you still have any questions? If yes, say, just type it up. If no, then you just type it up also. So, so we have no more question from the class. So, I declare, I will announce that this class is at the end, so everybody can leave the classroom. Okay. Next thing is that I will share the link and I download this video and upload to YouTube. So this Leo, you can use that for your own purpose, and of course for the students, they still can refer back to your presentation. I told them the coming exam questions. They can use your material to answer to the exam questions. So,
excellent. I'll make sure and put the answers in the material.
I still see why students still don't attend the class. This is very bad. Okay. So by the way, thank you very much, Leo. Thank you very much. Bye bye, everyone.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Greetings to family. Okay. Bye bye. All right.